Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King in his support of Israel and the Jewish people. And warm welcome to the programme. My guest today is all the way from Manchester. He's the Archbishop Doye Agama. Absolute pleasure to have you back on the programme, Doye.
Shalom, Simon. It's great to be back with you.
Really good. We did a really good programme last year, so I really appreciate you coming back on the programme again. But can you share with us again your testimony of how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and how the Lord has given you a tremendous love and passion for Israel and the Jewish people?
Well, I met the Lord personally for the first time back in 1968, which would be 51 years from where we're speaking now, in the midst of the conflict that is remembered as the Nigerian Civil War, or for others, the Biafran War. And that was a time when you didn't need to learn to pray, you prayed. So a lot of us got to know the Lord more deeply then. I did come from a Christian home, but right behind us was a Jewish family, and I was always very welcome there. Their son was like a brother, and I think probably my relationship with Israel and Jewish people goes back to that, to the simple fact that they were so open and welcoming to this scruffy young kid. And later I was gifted a copy of Anne Frank's diary by my mother, and it sort of grew along from there. I became more curious. I went on to read Leonoris.
That's a brilliant book.
Particularly Exodus affected me very, very deeply at quite a young age, and it's sort of grown on from there, really.
Excellent. And I can only describe you really as a spiritual and academic heavyweight, and the impact that you've had on the African Christian community has been profound, and particularly your love for Israel. Why is it so important that African Christians really stand up for Israel and the Jewish people and understand God's plans and purposes for them?
Well, more broadly, if there was no Judaism, and if it were not for Israel, there would be no Christianity for us to be part of. But for me, the relationship between Africa and the people of Israel goes back into the early pages of Scripture. The patriarchs lived in Africa. Abraham came to Africa to survive when perhaps he would have died. Africa sustained him. Isaac didn't leave the land of the promise, but he did interact with sons and daughters of Ham who were living in the land at that time. Jacob, of course, came into Africa with all of his family. And for me, the relationship goes back to that. I mean, today when we read of the biblical Exodus, we think of the Israelites as being enslaved, but that wasn't always the case. Truth is that they prospered mightily in Africa, and it was in fact their prosperity that turned this new generation and the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph against them, and began the period of their tribulation, which was perhaps God's means of moving them into the land of their promise. So I think that for Africans who know their Bible, they ought to see the relationship as not just something that is about us today, but a very, very long and deep relationship. And the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, came to Africa. It was Africa that saved him when he would have been killed as a child.
Absolutely.
And I think Africans have a right to know that they are very much part of this story, and that the relationship between Africans and the Bible and the Jewish people runs very deep.
Excellent. And you've just produced a new book, Asia, Christianity and the Bible. It's very good because you've got big writing in here, so if you've got a problem reading, you won't have a problem with this book. And obviously you talk about great depth, the biblical relationship between Israel and the Jewish people and the Bible. Why is it that sometimes some Africans actually forget that deep connection that stems from historically biblical times to the present times with Israel and the continent of Africa?
Okay, well, a lot of this can be explained by the route that Christianity took in reaching some parts of Africa, that it came via a Europe that was increasingly anti-Semitic, and a Europe that was also increasingly the colonizer, the empires of Europe. So you had Christianity that was nationalized and politicized in Europe, and also de-Judaized.
Yes.
And so many African Christians are rather unaware of their roots when it comes to the relationship with Israel and with the Jewish people, and also that in more modern times there have been influences on African people globally, stemming from issues around the Black Power movement in the States and things like that, which we will probably get into a little bit more later on in this program.
Absolutely. Doye, sadly I have to address something with you which is very important, and that is that I've had a number of emails from some of our viewers claiming that and accusing Israel of being a racist country, saying that they discriminate against their own Jewish Ethiopian population, and that they treat the African migrants who are trying to seek asylum in Israel terribly. Can you please put the record straight that Israel is not a racist nation?
Israel is not a racist nation. Okay, and I think that we need to separate those two things.
Absolutely.
The issues around the migrants and the issues that some of the Ethiopian Jews in Israel have faced are separate issues. Migrants are a particularly tragic case where they have been dumped essentially on Israel in many cases by the traffickers who would want to create a problem for Israel. Many of these people never intended to go to Israel in the first place. They paid money to people to get them to a European country. And the nearest place the traffickers could take them to was Israel. They have suffered terribly during that journey, and now they find themselves dumped, essentially, in Israel. That is a problem which any nation would struggle with. Now, Israel is certainly a purist nation in their heritage and in their origins. If you are not with them, then they're going to be very wary of you. Now, who are these people who are being dumped there? Obviously, Israel has a measure of skepticism. And if you look at the issues around that kind of immigration all across the Western world, then I think the problems that Israel has had with those migrants could be put into that context. So that's quite a separate issue from the Ethiopians, who are Jews and who were brought at great risk and great cost, great sacrifice from Ethiopia into Israel. In their case, I think it is part of the transition that new communities do go through. I'm old enough to remember when even Irish people had quite a lot of problems in England. I think that the situation has greatly improved. We've begun to have the first members of Knesset, judges, other high-level appointees. Huge numbers now of these young Ethiopians have served in the Israeli military and increasingly are becoming part of the fabric of society. And given a little time, that's just what they will be. It has always been, all through the centuries, it has been possible for people to become Jews and eventually just to be part of the Jewish community. So I think there's two separate issues there which get lumped together. The problems of the migrants who have been dumped by traffickers on Israel and the sort of social integration issues which a lot of Jews face when they come to Israel. Jews from Russia, from various places, do face problems when they come into Israel.
And I really appreciate you putting that record straight for us, Doye. Thank you so much. And let's have a look now at this news report that looks at how Israel has been dealing with this migrant crisis in Israel.
Benjamin Netanyahu has changed his mind again, just hours after deciding to suspend a new UNHCR deal to resettle some 16,000 African migrants in Western countries. The Israeli Prime Minister has now stated he will cancel the pact altogether. After meeting with angry residents of South Tel Aviv on Tuesday, the PM reconsidered after hearing their concerns. It was Netanyahu's fourth statement on the issue in a matter of hours. On Sunday, he had announced scrapping an earlier controversial plan to deport some 37,000 migrants to Africa, namely to Rwanda and Uganda. On Monday afternoon at a press conference, Netanyahu said the plan, which had drawn criticism from human rights groups both at home and abroad, would have been replaced by the new one negotiated with the UN. Under it, Israel would have given temporary residency to half the migrants and sent the other half to Western nations. However, those Western nations quickly said that they were unaware of any such agreement. The plan to let so many migrants stay was also met with outrage by conservative politicians as well as anti-migrant groups in South Tel Aviv, where many of the migrants reside. In a tweet, the education minister and leader of the Nationalist Party, Naftali Bennett, said the plan was a call for millions of potential migrant workers to come to Israel. He also warned that the credibility of the Israeli government is at stake. Those concerns have now tipped the balance in favour of rejecting any deal with the UN, who have now urged Israel to reconsider their decision. The deportation legislation has been widely criticised at home and abroad, even by some of Israel's closest supporters.
And Doye, I think we have to really mention, you mentioned there about the great sacrifice that Israel took part in Operation Solomon that dates back to 1991, where Israel airlifted something like 14,000 Ethiopian Jews out of Africa in 36 hours. An incredible military feat to rescue so many of the Ethiopian Jews caught up in the Ethiopian civil war. But can we talk a little bit now about the deep relationship? We've talked about the biblical relationship between Israel and the continent of Africa, and what's been on the Prime Minister's heart, Benjamin Netanyahu, is really to reach out to the African continent, and now Israel has developed incredible new ties with African nations. How important is it for the continent of Africa to have that relationship with Israel, both spiritually, politically, and economically?
I think it's extremely important, and I think that Israel is one of the countries that has so much to offer Africa. Many parts of Africa suffer from problems with water, with the development of agriculture, and development of industry. And Israel has proven over and over again that it is possible for these miracles to happen, for a nation that was largely desert to become an exporter of food, not only feeding its own population, but sending food out as exports, and the methods of irrigation and of other aspects of agriculture could make such a vast contribution, and already are making huge contributions to Africa. There are very few other nations anywhere in the world that have not only the technology but the track record of doing things like that, who can offer Africa these kinds of solutions. And I think that African leaders need to be hard-headed and practical about the decisions that they take, and refuse to be swayed by political blocs who will put pressure on them, who are anti-Israel, and take what their people need. Africans need the blessing of Israeli know-how, Israeli technology, and the fact that when they connect with Israel, they are connecting with God's people.
Excellent. So let's have a look at this excellent video that connects Israel and a new developing relationship with the African nations.
Ethiopia's Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn met Israeli President Reuven Rivlin on Monday during a two-day visit to the region. The talks centered on strengthening ties between the two countries.
We represent truly the African-Israeli relationship as a gateway to Africa. So we will do everything at our disposal to make Israeli-Africa relationship to mushroom and grow, and Ethiopia will take leadership in this regard.
The visit is also being seen as part of Israel's efforts to woo Africa following Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's historic visit to Ethiopia in July last year.
We are very anxious to get back to the connection that we had with Africa, and you are a real place and nation that we have to ask you to be our sponsors in Africa in order to let us be once again people who can attend all the meetings and the conferences of Africa, because when we are looking to the future and to the next decade, we know that Africa is the place.
Desalegn is scheduled to meet Netanyahu on Tuesday.
Very much again.
And so encouraging to see those relations develop between Israel and many African nations, which know that they'll get blessed from it. I mean, there are so many shared issues, aren't there, when it comes to Israel and Africa? I mean, for example, Israel can help in terms of security. There's a growing problem of Islamic terrorism in Africa, including your own country in Nigeria. And the Israelis have the technical know-how and the ability to deal with terrorism, as well as their incredible innovation in terms of agriculture and helping the economies of Africa grow. But we can see that from those video clips that Israel is very, very proud of its relationship with many African nations. What does this mean for Africans, knowing that Israel it does truly care about so many African states it has a relationship with?
Well, I can't speak for any particular African nation. I'm British, but I obviously am part of the diaspora here. I think that the relationship with Israel is many faceted. There are implications, obviously, in terms of dealing with security issues. Unfortunately, because of its history, Israel has expertise in dealing with things like terrorism, but also in the field of medicine. There are many inventions or breakthroughs in medicine that have come out of Israel that would be extremely helpful. And we just saw in that clip the response to Ebola in Central Africa by Israel. I think the time has come for leaders across the African world, whether on the continent or here in Europe and right across the world, to really take a good look and say, look, the time has come for us to develop our own independent view on what our relationship with Israel and the Jewish people needs to be, and refuse to be influenced by what other people may want to think. They may be entitled to their views. We might wish they thought otherwise, but I think the time has come for us to chart our own relationship with Israel and the Jewish people.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at how Israel is helping many African nations, particularly with its aid projects.
Innovation Africa was funded 9 years ago with a very simple mission, which is to bring Israeli solar technologies to transform schools, medical centers, and most importantly, to pump water. We are operating in 7 African countries, and we have so far installed solar technology in over 100 villages. The reason why Africa is still in poverty is because of the lack of energy. Because there is no energy, people are still searching for water because there is no energy to pump water. People do not have access to vaccines and medicines because there is no electricity in medical centers. And because there is no energy, people cannot get good education. And yet, when you look at the sun, there is so much energy, so much potential. And if we could just harness the energy from the sun, we can change it. We've been using solar energy since the creation of Israel. Almost on every building, there are solar panels. And what we are doing at Innovation Africa, it's simply by bringing the same technologies, simple technologies, to make a change here in the villages.
Are you ready to have clean water? Yes!
Thank you for having come from Israel to take us away from the nakedness.
Thank you very much for the clean water.
You are our fathers and mothers from Israel.
Because today Israel is a strong country, because of everything that has been invented, I feel it's our responsibility to help.
Are you ready? Yes! 1, 2, 3, go!
So if you wanted to know what Israel is doing to help the continent of Africa, there's the evidence by helping to put in solar powers to give so many African states and villages and towns their own electricity. That was inspirational, Doye. The fact that something about the Israeli heart and something about the Israeli culture, which runs deep, is let's improve and help the lives of others. And we see a wonderful example of Israel there using its know-how and its technology to bring electricity to an African village.
It was very inspirational, and what's even more important for me is the fact that when Israel works in those situations, or when the Israeli experts come, they are installing what we used to call appropriate technology. It's a technology that fits the situation, that has been developed in similar circumstances, and that is not going to require huge maintenance and parts being flown in from anywhere. It'll just work in that situation, and that's the great thing about it. Because of where Israel itself is situated, it's been able to tackle some of these problems, and is now able to transfer that knowledge into Africa. And it's wonderful. The beautiful simplicity of some of the solutions that we're seeing there is just wonderful.
Absolutely. And now we're going to go on and talk about one of the greatest icons of the 20th century, and that's Dr. Martin Luther King. Can you share with us, Doye, what Dr. Martin Luther King means to you?
Yes, well, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is someone who was able to translate, if you like, the moral capital of the African diaspora into a leverage. He understood that oppressed people have power. They have moral power, as has been said by others. It's not an original thought of mine. Now, what he did was be able to leverage that, and that's why his peaceful approach was so important, that he showed up his oppressors and shamed them in a way, and has become a catalyst for almost all of the human rights movements of the late 20th century. Everywhere from the fall of apartheid in South Africa to movements across the world, whatever opinion anyone might have about the LGBT movement, I don't think that would have happened without Dr. King. So wherever you've had people standing up for their freedom, and whatever form, in the late 20th century, it goes back to him.
And sadly, it's not universal knowledge, but Dr. Martin Luther King had a tremendous love for Israel and the Jewish people. How did he end up having such a love for Israel and the Jewish people?
Well, first of all, he knew his Bible. And if you study the Bible with an open mind, you will come to a conclusion that what the Bible says is true, that the nation and the people of Israel are blessed to be a blessing. I think also that he, like many in the African continent and in the diaspora, related to the story of Israel as a people who came out of oppression and by God's help found not only freedom but also stability and independence. And so that resonates with people like Dr. King in a very major way.
Excellent. So let's have a look at Dr. Martin Luther King now talking about his love for Israel and the Jewish people.
The whole world must see that Israel must exist and has a right to exist and is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world.
My Jewish brothers and sisters said to me amid anti-Semitism anywhere, we don't need your support. We have enough Jewish power to deal with this problem ourselves. I would still take a stand against anti-Semitism because it's wrong, it's unjust, and it's evil. If my Catholic brothers and sisters said to me, amid bigotry toward Catholics, we don't need your support in this because we have enough Catholic power to deal with it, I would still take a stand against bigotry toward Catholics because it is wrong, it is evil, and it is unjust.
I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime. I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned in my life, and under those tragic circumstances, is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder.
Perhaps if there had been a broader understanding of the uses of nonviolent direct action in Germany when Hitler was rising and consolidating his power, the brutal extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of other war dead might have been averted, and Germany might never have become totalitarian if Protestants and Catholics had engaged in nonviolent direct action and had made the oppression of the Jews their very own oppression, and had come into the streets beside the Jew to scrub the sidewalks, and had Gentiles worn the stigmatizing yellow armbands by the millions, a unique form of mass resistance to the Nazi regime might have developed. I'm fully aware of the terror, the intimidation, the brutality, and the force the fascists were so quick to use. But I am also aware that in the South today, some races of the same mentality have been curbed in their resistance to nonviolent action when practiced on a mass scale. Today, people all over the world should be engaging in mass action to protest anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. That is a dangerous silence today which unintentionally encourages evil to flourish. Was Albert Einstein right when he said, "The world is in greater peril from those who tolerate evil than from those who actively commit it"? Did not President Kennedy warn that those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence? Will the nation ever forget the searing impact of Rabbi Joachim Prince's admonition as he spoke at the March on Washington in 1963? When I was a rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned in my life and under tragic circumstances is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remain silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder.
And Martin Luther King's message there resonates even today, that we can't afford to be silent when we see the rise of Jew hatred in the nations, when we see the rise of racism as well. This is why we need to stand up against these evils. I found that speech by Dr. Martin Luther King there, Doye, incredibly inspirational. And it just shows that not only was he passionate about ending segregation in southern parts of the United States, but he was also dedicated to the fight against Jew hatred. How important is it as well that African Christians also make a righteous stand against the rise of anti-Semitism we're seeing around the world today?
Well, as Dr. King so eloquently put it in those clips, if you are unable to stand for freedom for any, then you have failed in your fight for freedom for yourself. And the legacy that he has left still challenges Christian leaders today as to where do you stand when it comes to anti-Semitism, to racism, and to the oppression of people around the world. And I think, Simon, that this shows just where or how far Christianity has moved from the time when Dr. King was saying those words to the Christian leaders of today who have often been silent, and silent even in the face of the persecution and massacre of their fellow Christians, silent and even negative in their comments about Israel. Dr. King still stands as a huge challenge to us today, and every Christian leader who watches this program needs to reflect on that.
Absolutely. And also, like yourself, Doye, when you shared in the beginning of the programme of your friendship with your Jewish friend and how that helped to develop your love for Israel and the Jewish people. And the same can be said of Dr. Martin Luther King with his friendship with Rabbi Israel Dresner, who they met each other in 1962 after Rabbi Dresner arrived as part of the Freedom Riders and was arrested in Allenby in Georgia. Yes. And Dr. Martin Luther King met him in a prison cell, and they shook hands across a celled prison. So isn't it interesting that that friendship has developed, and his understanding of Israel and the Jewish people played a huge part because of that personal relationship? How important is it for African Christian leaders to reach out and develop those strong friendships with Israel and the Jewish community?
Oh, it's very important, and there have been some very encouraging signs. There's been work done by the multicultural department of churches together in England, bringing together Pentecostal, Black Pentecostal, other multicultural, multi-ethnic church leaders with rabbis and other leaders of the Jewish community. And within the time that I was involved with the Council of Christians and Jews in Manchester, we did have an increase in the sort of friendships and relationship building. I think it's extremely important that we get to know the leaders on both sides of these communities. But I want to just pick up on something that you just mentioned there about the involvement of the Jewish community in the work of Dr. King. Many people don't realize how involved the Jewish community was in the work that he was doing. Many of the lawyers who represented him and other African Americans when they were arrested because of their civil rights activity were Jewish lawyers who gave their time and did that work for no pay at all. There was funding that was being given by Jews, principally in America at that time, to the work of Dr. King. Financial donations were being given. And so the identification of this moral capital and how to leverage, how the oppressed can leverage and bring the question of morality to the forefront of the national dialogue was something that both these communities recognized. And I would also want to salute the work of my friend, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who has in many ways tried to carry forward the work of Dr. King after he was tragically murdered.
Sadly, talking about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in '68, impact has that had on the relationship between the African American community and the American Jewish community that through the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King developed and strengthened those ties? And what you said about Jewish lawyers giving up their time to help also get so many of these African leaders into positions of power and influence, getting them, setting up meetings with the high officials in the Kennedy administration, and really being a kind of vehicle for change in the United States.
Well, it was a tragic loss, and I think one of the great negatives that came out of that is that the anger that is generated, the disappointment generated by the murder, assassination of Dr. King, found part of its expression in a new generation of much more militant, more radical, younger African-American leaders who in many ways were not as connected to or as friendly with the American Jewish community. And that this situation in some ways was exploited by representatives of other faiths and other philosophies, and a greater level of a more antagonistic stance. Now, with hindsight, it's probably understandable, but it is very tragic and has had long-term consequences.
So what is the legacy of Dr. King now for African Christians to stand with Israel and stand with the Jewish people, particularly this rising climate of Jew hatred that we're seeing, the likes we haven't seen since pre-World War II years, which is over 70 years. I mean, if you look at France, for example, France has had a kind of around a 70% increase in anti-Semitic instances over the past year. And it's getting out of control. So what role can African Christians play in really standing with Israel and the Jewish people?
They can play a major role. I think that the majority of the diaspora is connected to the church in some form or the other. And I think that it's important that Israel particularly and the Jewish communities continue to build their relationships with the leaders of the diaspora churches and work with them constructively to educate, to inform, not just these leaders, but their communities about the legacy of Dr. King and his work with the Jewish community in America and his love for Israel. I think that it's important that the generation that is now coming to leadership needs to be in touch with this legacy.
Absolutely.
That it can help to inform them and help them in their own relationship with the Jewish people and Israel. And here in the United Kingdom, where we are finding it so hard to build community cohesion, I think that this is one very important contribution among others.
And how important is it that, so for example, African Christian pastors and their congregations actually take time and to visit Israel and to meet with Israeli leaders and to develop that close relationship between Israel and the African church?
Visits to Israel are a wonderful experience, a spiritual experience that will bring the Bible alive to you in ways that you had never imagined. If you're a pastor out there of an African majority or minority ethnic or multicultural church, do make plans to go to Israel. But it will be more than a spiritual experience, because you will get to know the people of Israel. You get to meet them there in Israel, and that will help to inform you to make your own mind up and not be swayed just by what anybody else is saying about Israel.
Excellent. Archbishop Doye, thank you so much for being my guest on the programme.
Thank you.
I'm so pleased the Lord has put you in such a prominent position to have an influence on your community about the importance of Israel and the Jewish people. Thank you. And I just want to thank you for watching today's programme. All of us can actually follow in the footsteps of the late and great Dr. Martin Luther King in our love and support for Israel and the Jewish people. And leave you with this song in dedication to the great man himself.
The whole world must see that Israel must exist and has a right to exist and is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world.
Well, Martin Luther King never failed to stand up for Jews and support Israel. He said criticism of Zionism is a new disguise for anti-Semitism, and solemnly pledged he would help maintain and uphold the Jewish people's good name, cause he truly believed that bigotry in any form is a travesty. You see, Martin Luther King was aware of the special relationship that's shared by African Americans and Jews. He knew both our peoples were used and abused, oppressed so hard we could hardly stand, involuntarily forced from our land. And we were both shaped by the unsavory, tragic experience of slavery. We've both been victims of segregation, forced to live in some ghetto locations. We've both been targets of legislation passed only for discrimination. We've both been forced to watch our backs simply cause we're Jewish or black. We've both seen oppression and genocide on levels unprecedented worldwide. So Martin Luther King never failed to stand up for Jews and support Israel. He said criticism of Zionism is a new disguise for anti-Semitism, and solemnly pledged he would help maintain and uphold the Jewish people's good name, for he truly believed that bigotry in any form is a travesty. He wondered why anyone would be anti-Semitic when he could see that Jews were doing so much good for the cause of tolerance and brotherhood. He expressed his gratitude to the 15 rabbis arrested in St. Augustine because they joined in that demonstration protesting racist segregation. He praised another rabbi from Cleveland who went down south and was brutally beaten in Mississippi when he joined the fight for African American civil rights. And he never forgot the two Jewish men who defended freedom right till the end, when the KKK killed them both just because they were helping black people vote. King said it's impossible to record the contribution that Jews made toward the struggle of black people to be free, cause he knew that we helped out so greatly. And Martin Luther King never failed to stand up for Jews and support Israel. He said criticism of Zionism is a new disguise for anti-Semitism, and solemnly pledged he would help maintain and uphold the Jewish people's good name, cause he truly believed that bigotry in any form is a travesty. Despite the fact that MLK was a black man living in the USA, he said he would not stand idly by watching while his Jewish brethren die. He said we must stand with all our might to protect the nation of Israel's right to exist, to protect its integrity, cause for Israel peace means security. When he looked at Israel, all he could see was a great outpost for democracy. In his view, Israel Israel was clearly one, a marvelous example of what could be done. A desert land to transform for good into an oasis of brotherhood. But he knew Israel can only be at peace when we have security. And Martin Luther King never failed to stand up for Jews and support Israel. He said criticism of Zionism is a new disguise for anti-Semitism, and solemnly pledged he would help maintain and uphold the Jewish people's good name, cause he truly believed that bigotry in any form is a travesty.